Hi, Misha here, and this is a bit of a different type of black box video. I have been interested in Swiss SiG, SiG, SG550 family guns for a good long time, and they're also one of the kind of major products that I've been selling ever since JDI, now SAN Imports, kind of got into the game back in 2015. So I get asked a lot of questions, and with interest on the rise, even though we've covered this in other videos on the main channel, this information's kind of all scattered out and what have you. So I thought I would do kind of a frequently asked questions, a basic guide breaking the variables down, because it's really quite logical, as you'd imagine from being Swiss, when you stop and think about it. So I'm just going to kind of dump what I know. I probably will get some basic numbers a little fudgy, because I'm just sitting it on the porch as usual, relaxing, but hopefully I can convey something and it'll help out, and I will put timestamps in for kind of each of the sub-topics or categories. So with that, let's just jump in. Birth, development, and early evolution of the design. It actually dates back quite a ways, at least the roots. All the way back to 1963, just a few years after the Swiss military had formally adopted the STGW 57. The new 223 round was already making waves around the world. Russia was already interested in it, and as were Switzerland and Italy. Or rather, SiG and Beretta. In 1963, they formed a partnership to develop a rifle to fire the new cartridge. This would evolve into the SG530-1. This would have a gas piston, long stroke style, but it would use the roller system from the STGW 57. So it would have a gas system, but a roller system, sort of kind of not really like the MG42, but it gives you an idea. But there was a point of contention. Beretta wanted to go to a rotating bolt with lugs. They had good experience with the two-lug design from the M1 Garand and their BM59. SiG was still kind of committed to the roller system, though. Maybe a little more elegant, but definitely required a lot tighter tolerances and what have you. This really did become a big point of contention, so much so that in 1968, the partnership was dissolved, and each would go their own way. But neither would drop the design. Beretta would go on introducing their rotating bolt system and creating what would become the AR-70. SiG would finally see the light, dropping their roller system and going to the SG540. Both of these would occur in the 1970s, really around the same time, both firing the new 5.56 cartridge 223, which at that time was basically 55 grain. From there, they would actually put the 540 into production. It would be produced in France by Manurhin for the French government, French military, while the FAMAS was getting ready. It would also get exported to Chile, which still makes them today, actually, if I may. But that wouldn't be the end. Switzerland, at least the Swiss Army, would not adopt the 540. Back to Italy for a minute, the AR-70 was quite successful, but not perfect. It was used by special forces, but it would be updated to the AR-70-90, which was adopted in 1990 by all of the Italian military, at least the vast majority. So it would evolve there. It still has a very big passing resemblance to the Swiss design. It's kind of fun. Check one out if you haven't seen one. Well, in Switzerland, finally around 1978, the Swiss government, the Swiss Army primarily, was getting serious about getting away from the 7.5 GP11 cartridge. It's quite old by now. And of course, the SGW-57 rifle. So they read out specifications. They wanted a new small diameter cartridge. Didn't have to be specifically 5.56, but something small in that kind of range. The new rifle needed to be more compact. It needed to be lighter, handier, and it needed to be cheaper to build, mass-produced than the SGW-57, which, to be fair, is not exactly that hard to do, and that was the most expensive battle rifle known to man, probably known to most aliens, too. And so SiG would take their 540 design, around 1979, 1980, update it to what they would call the 541. Basically changing a few things here and there to suit the Swiss needs. Also something the Swiss Army requested. They wanted a full-length infantry rifle with a 20-some-odd inch barrel. And they wanted a shorter, so-called headquarters carbine, obviously with a shorter barrel. Thus, the 541 would be introduced with the barrel in the 20-21 inch range. And the 543 would be introduced by SiG for trials with a 14-some-odd inch barrel. Now, they weren't alone. They had competition from Bern, who had their own C42 prototype. They even had their own cartridge. There was a bit of a debate as to which small diameter cartridge they would go with. But finally, in 1983, the Swiss Army would select what they named 5.6 millimeter. Not 5.56, but 5.6. Ultimately, this would be a 63 grain cartridge, not 62, not 55. And since this is kind of what SiG had been pushing, they would decide at really around the same time to go with the 541, 543 setup from SiG. Now, the reason they did the 5.6, aside from Swiss wanting to squeeze every drop of accuracy they can out of a round, Switzerland was still neutral. It really is today, but has been, and they were still caught in the middle of the Cold War. They did not want to be seen adopting a NATO, or for that matter, a Soviet cartridge. They wanted to be seen using their own. To that end, it was also optimized for a 1 in 10 twist, not 1 in 12, not 1 in 9, not 1 in 7, 1 in 10. But instead of going in, originally the plan was to put 5.6 and the new SiG rifle into production and service pretty much right away. But there were a few teething problems with the rifle, but mostly it was budgetary concerns from the Swiss government. But this actually turned out to be not a bad thing. It gave SiG time to really refine the design in 1984. They turned the 541 into the SG550 and the 543 into the SG551. So rifle and carbine. There were several updates. For example, they went to a 4-way selector, safe, single shot, 3-round burst, and full auto is standard. They went away from the 540 style buttstock to the modern one we know, polymer and more stronger with a metal frame inside. They tweaked the sights a bit. Probably one important change, they went to a more corrosion resistant gas system, mostly made of stainless steel with special fancy pants treating. They also worked on the metal treatment for the surfaces of the gun to help them be more weather and corrosion resistance. And just, little tweaks like that. So it's a good thing. Thus, finally in 1986, the first batch of 5.50s was officially accepted by the Swiss Army for testing, trials, what have you. However, full adoption and full production really wouldn't be, well, full production would go ahead, but full adoption really wouldn't be officially made until 1990, thus the name STGW-90. What about the 5.51, the carbine, the headquarters gun? Well, it did receive a designation, STGW-90K for Kurz. But it doesn't seem like, outside of purchasing some for trials, testing, and maybe just a handful, the Swiss Army really wanted it. I think they just didn't see a point, because the 550, while at 9 pounds with a nearly 21-inch barrel, to us today seems large. To them, coming off the SGGW57, it's a lot lighter. It's got a folding stock. It seemed like it was a good one-size-fits-mostly-all for them. And again, they were kind of going through a budgetary thing. They made it. They kind of made it work. But that's not to say that SiG was abandoning the carbine. Actually, far from it. They found success selling it to foreign users, as well as Swiss police, and some to export. It actually became quite popular. I've said in videos that actually the 551 LB is my favorite gun as a shooter, even more than the 550. So for the first decade of life, those were the two guns that were in the lineup, at least for, by and large. The sniper would be the next to come, but it was a very special, limited production, read expensive even by Swiss standards. And so they was never targeted at the army. It was for police. So they never really made many of them. But yeah, they would start issuing them kind of wide and far to the Swiss Army, with the main production lasting until about 1996, 1998. And by that point, they pretty much had enough to suit all their needs. While the gun was cheaper and faster to build than the SGGW57, still by modern standard, it is one of the most, if not the most expensive mass-produced assault rifle in the world. But, there is a lot to be said for that. Service and 21st century models. Well, yeah, as you know, the Swiss military, Swiss Army, is basically a conscript army where every able-bodied male serves, and they have 3 different tiers. I'm not going to break all that down here. You've got Wikipedia. See, that's the nice thing about this personal channel and Blackbox videos. I can be lazy when I want to. They would typically issue the gun, and the soldier would take it home. He would be issued 2 magazines and 40 rounds of ammunition to fill the mags. And the idea was that should be enough ammunition for him to get from his home to his local designated meeting spot with his squadron platoon. Because, Swiss marksmen, they figure if they give a guy 40 rounds, when he shows up, he needs to at least have 42 kills, right? I mean, yeah. So that's what they did. They went for quality over quantity. Only 2 mags, but they were very high quality. Only 40 rounds, but it was extremely good stuff. I should also point out, at this point, the standard cartridge, the FMJ, was 63 grain. There was also, still is, a 69 grain hollow point that's more of a match target load, also used by police, especially in the 550 sniper. Those are the 2 main weights made in Switzerland, although there are others, of course. But yeah, they would have the basic sling, which I'll talk about, 2 mags, no idea on the mag pouch, never found any evidence, and typically iron sights. In the STGW90, with its nearly 21-inch barrel, was a standard issue gun. And typically soldiers could keep them after their service time, although they would have to be permanently converted to semi-auto, and they would have to pay a small administration fee. Although if they didn't want to keep them, they didn't have to. The really first new variant to come into the Swiss Army was the STGW04, and it was purchased in 2 versions. The STGW04 is the SG552. Now, the standard 04 was the 552 LB, and the STGW04K KURS is the 552 SB. The SB would have a prong flash hider, and there were several styles, 3-prong, 4-prong, the Rotex. They could mount a suppressor, although usually they just had the flash hider. And at least this early on, they had the traditional diopter sights and traditional folding buttstock. And we're still in the classic gray and green for the Army. These were basically used for special forces, what they called professional career soldiers. They're short size, 8.9-inch barrel, not counting the flash hider, and relatively lightweight at 7 pounds. Made them well suited for urban warfare, urban combat, what have you. Yeah, special needs. Not that many were ever purchased, and they were pretty uncommon. As for the longer-barreled STGW 04, it has the 13.6, 13.7 barrel. It could mount a bayonet, it could fire a rifle grenade, but it could not easily be suppressed, something worth pointing out. So, essentially, feature-wise, it was much like the STGW 90, just a lot shorter. So it was used as a carbine. If the 90 was their M16, the 04 was their M4 carbine. It was often issued about 2 per squadron, 2 per platoon, and usually wasn't a gun taken home. They were usually left at depots and carried by officers, commanders, or just anyone else who had other duties and didn't need a big heavy gun getting in their way. Basically used as kind of a PDW. They were also issued, not unsurprisingly, by the Swiss paratroopers, again in small numbers, but they were there, and by Swiss reconnaissance and some other intelligence corps and that kind of thing. Again, used as a carbine. It's kind of interesting that they skipped the 5.51 and just went to the 5.52. Well, and I'll talk about the 5.52 to 5.53 story in a different section. If you see the timestamps, you know that. When the 5.53 replaced the 5.52 in production, it also replaced it in the Swiss Army. New purchase guns would be 5.53s, designated as the STGW 07 for the long barrel, and the STGW 07K for the short barrel. The short barrels would be suppressor ready, at least later production ones would, with the long barrels just not. They had a bunch of 04s, of course, and as I've said, waste not, want not. They would update their 04s to the new standard. SIG would call this the 5.52A1, SAN now, I suppose, I should say, in this time period. And the Swiss Army would call them STGW 04/07s if they're updated. Now, most of the 04/07s, as far as I know, and I could be wrong, probably am, would have had the Diopters still. But later production 07s, at least, and 07Ks, would start going over to the Picatinny rail, which meant they would go away from the traditional diopter sights and more to things like ACOGs and aim points with magnifiers. Also, the SGW 07K would go to different flash hiders to be more suppressor compatible, and it would start to use the new 4-position gas regulator instead of the 2. While they really aren't buying new production SGW 90s, they're just refurbishing their existing ones. They are buying new production 07s and in the smaller numbers 07Ks. And it's said that the Swiss Army, the Swiss government at least, has taken delivery of about 450,000 guns in this series, most of them being the 90s, but some others in there. And it said that next year they have plans to purchase several thousand more of the 07 and 07Ks. So they still are actively buying the newer guns, which makes sense with modern warfare. Why would it not? And there's still plenty of 04s and 04, 07s still kicking around. So never you fear, they're not getting rid of them anytime soon. As far as other guns, SIG is said that they had produced around 600,000 total. About 35,000 are registered as semi-autos when they leave the factory, meaning the roughly 100,000 left are select fire guns that have been purchased by other foreign users, be they military or police, or maybe some private security. But as you can see, the vast majority, 3/4 of production, have gone for Swiss use. Most to the Army, some to the Air Force, and some to the police. And of course, since Switzerland is neutral, they pretty much are just used for practice and having fun with target shooting. But they are there if ever needed. Operation features, mechanics, things of that nature. What makes the SG550 what it is? Of course, it has the craftsmanship, attention to detail that you would expect from SiGs and SiG. And it borrowed quite liberally from the M16 AR-15 of the day, as well as the AKM and HK products and SIG's earlier products. The operating system is very Kalashnikov. It is a long stroke gas piston with 2-lug rotating bolt. The big difference is the recoil spring. Instead of being behind the bolt carrier as on an AK, it is wrapped around the gas piston. And also because of this, the gas piston and bolt carrier can easily be separated, in fact have to be separated for disassembly. Once this is done by removing the cocking handle, the bolt itself comes out of the carrier just like you would on an AK. Very similar. It even has a tail very similar to an AK. And it has a spring-loaded firing pin extractor, has a fixed ejector inside the receiver, what have you. From the AR-15, it kind of borrows its trigger group is its own thing, don't get me wrong. But it definitely has the nicer trigger group of an AR-15. It has a safety inspired from it. More or less its ergonomics can be said to be inspired by the AR-15. Although it still uses rock and lock magazines, they're not as severely rock and lock as, say, an AK. They're more like HK style rock and lock. The gun has pretty ambidextrous controls, pretty lefty friendly. It has an ambidextrous safety, ambidextrous mag release, be it the Stanag or the Swiss mag version. It does have an automatic last round hold open with manual release, external release control, but it's only on the left side. And the charging handle is only on the right side, although on the original models it was upswept, so it could be grasped over the side of the gun if needed. On newer models, it is horizontal, so it doesn't interfere with optics. It is reciprocating, like on an AK. It is rubber coated for comfort, and also just because, well, Switzerland can get cold in the winter. There's also a kind of two-piece rubber seal behind it. I mean, I hate to really call it a dust cover, although I guess you could, but it's more of a seal. And you would think this would be a part that would wear out, but it doesn't seem to, which is good because unfortunately it is riveted into the upper receiver, so not something you can readily replace. That is one negative I will say about it. The furniture is quite durable. The handguards are made of a tough, flexible polymer, which are well ventilated. Newer versions have holes drilled in them to mount rail sections. Older versions did not. The pistol grip is reasonably comfortable, not too big, not too small. It has a storage compartment for small gear, although most of the time, about the only thing you'll find in a Swiss military gun is a troop tag, kind of like you'd find in K-31s. The buttstock is basically metal, has a metal frame, metal skeleton, with a polymer overmold. so it's quite durable, and the latch and button are metal. It locks into the side of the handguards, which is most often a polymer tab, which you'd think would be a potential weak spot, but thanks to just good quality materials, it doesn't seem to be something that breaks overly often. The gun does have an adjustable trigger. Now, it's not like a full adjustable target trigger, it just has an adjustable stop. If you remove the pistol grip, you can see two nuts there. You can tighten or loosen them to change it a bit, to try to improve or make it more to your liking. The trigger guard under it folds either to the left or right side and locks in the middle securely with a detent. This is for use with one of your gloves or just another time the trigger guard might be in the way. Disassembly is dirt simple. That's something it did borrow from the AR-15. It has front and rear takedown pins, but the pins themselves are very, very similar to the ones used in the SGW57 and thus are not captive. They have a very fancy spring mechanism in them where you press the end and spring clips draw in to pull them out. When they're in the gun, they're not walking out because they're held in with two very strong steel tabs. Very interesting design. The sights are HK style in the sense that they're rotating diopters. They are relatively low profile, so the soldier doesn't have to present a very big silhouette if shooting from a position. This is actually one of the things that the Army really liked during the trials, was that the soldier could hunker down quite a bit more than on the original SG550. Original versions were also provided with a mount for different scopes, although they weren't all that often issued. What was often issued was the little folding light bipod. It folds very flush into the handguards and can easily be removed if you remove the lower handguard. And it's okay. It's lightweight. It doesn't get in the way, but it's a little flimsy, and it can fold up on you, so just be mindful of that. Really, the whole gun disassembles very conveniently. It's very easy to take it apart with either no tools or very basic tools. The gas system's easy to get to. The gas regulator comes right out. Standard, it has 2 positions, although 4-position versions are available upon request on newer guns for suppressor use. The barrel is cold hammer forged, but not chrome lined, at least not on the original guns. Interestingly, Valmet in Finland also didn't chrome line their bores. The traditional SGW90 has a single piece barrel, meaning the flash hider is machined as part of the barrel, so the only way you're getting it off is with a torch. The bayonet lug, on the other hand, is easily removed. There's a loop under the gas block. The traditional Swiss bayonet will fit from the SGW57, although a newer variant was made for the SGW90. It's only held in with a pin, so if you want to use a NATO lug, you just push the pin out and put in a NATO lug and repin it. Alternatively, on newer guns with quad rail handguards, the quad rails will use this as a anchor point in the front, so at least some of them you can't use a bayonet with anymore. I'm talking about the full metal quad rails. Traditionally, you just had the sling loops on the left side of the gas block, left side of the upper receiver behind the rear sight, and also a third in kind of the crook of the stock. But with newer models that have the pick rail, they've added a second sling loop on the right side rear of the upper receiver. Just something to point out. The guns are extremely well made, and that's kind of the whole point behind them. It was very much a buy once, cry once mentality. They were okay with paying a good bit of money, but they didn't want guns that would break on them frequently. So things like the receivers, the trunnions, the barrels, the bolts, even the bolt carriers and whatnot, really are built to last tens of thousands of rounds. That's why the Swiss Army hasn't really needed to order any new SGGW90s in 20 years. I'm not saying they haven't made a couple of small purchase orders before someone asks me. I don't know that they have. I'm just saying it wouldn't shock me. But there haven't been any major orders since the late 90s. And SiG, Sans SiG, continues to refurbish guns. They'll do things like replace the recoil spring. I mean, of course they would after 20,000, 30,000 rounds. Maybe replace the firing pin, the extractor, or their springs. Maybe rework the trigger group. It seems like the only kind of even somewhat major component that breaks on them is the furniture, and even that's at a very low rate. But, you know, military and whatnot, buttstocks get kicked around and beat up on a bit, and handguards get crashed on. So, you know, it's pretty common to see new furniture installed on military service guns. But other than that, the guns just hold up really well. It does kind of amuse me when people talk about spare parts and worrying about, well, if I get a gun from JDI, where will I get spare parts? The truth is, what spare parts do you need? There aren't any parts known to be vulnerable, known to be breaking, aside from, of course, those in the 5.52, but that's a special case. I would say if you were worried, just get kind of a spare bolt repair kit, like spare firing pins, firing pin spring. Really, there's not much else you need. The gun's just going to work. I mean, get a replacement recoil spring if you really want. But the guns are built to last. And they were built for accuracy, not surprisingly. Hence why 20-round mags were the standard for so long. The whole full auto fire was not something that was commonly employed. You know, even for the 1980s, it wasn't a revolutionary gun. They just kind of made a really high quality, but even by the standards of that time, pretty conventional gun. And of course, by today's standards, that is definitely true. There isn't something the SG550 does that other guns don't. It's just really nicely made. People have called it a Rolex, and I think that's a very apt comparison. It is mass-produced in the same way Rolexes are. And, you know, Rolex doesn't do a whole lot that other watches don't, but it does it so well, and it's enjoyable. And sometimes the subjective overrides the objective. But you can look online for more. But yeah, the mechanics are nice. There's nothing bad about it. There's no overt problems with the ergonomics or lack of a major feature. But it doesn't have any super cool, interesting features either. It's just a really nicely made gun. And I do like how the different versions, 550, 551, 553, scale. You got, you know, big, middle, small. Meaning a lot of the parts are interchangeable. The differences are pretty much with the gas system and barrel. Once you go past that, the receivers and the stocks and all that tend to be the same throughout all the guns, which is great. That means, yeah, you can easily get replacement parts, at least relatively so. The 552, the 553, and that story. The 552, sometimes called Commando, is very popular thanks in large part to video games. Also because many police agencies purchased them when they were released in the late 20th and early 21st century. This was the smallest SG550X type gun to come out, and it was quite a bit lighter than previous models. For example, the full 550 was over 9 pounds. The 551 was about 7.5 pounds for the SB and closer to 8 for the LB. The 552 was just about 7 pounds. Nice, handy, reliable, all that. Unfortunately, the spring technology in the late 90s really wasn't up to scratch, plus SiG was going through a lot of downsizing, not doing a whole lot of R&D at the time. So instead of using the traditional spring over and around the gas piston, they went to kind of an AK style spring. You still had a piston in the front, but you had the recoil spring behind the bolt carrier now instead of in front. they didn't want to put it in the front because they were worried about the heat from the barrel and other things screwing up the spring, which, to be fair, with the springs of the day, was probably a legitimate concern. Unfortunately, to make this work, they had to change up the bolt carrier, including using a different charging handle. It's a kind of a different little cylinder thing than you're used to. And the spring would ride behind, and so when you would open it, it would kind of shoot out at you under tension. Now, internet sites have kind of made it sound like it tries to scare you alive. It's not quite that violent, but it's pretty violent. I mean, you definitely want to keep your hand over it and catch it when it comes out, that's for sure. So disassembly was a little more tricky, and just imagine if you're in the field, you open it up the wrong way, and your spring shoots out the back of your gun into some weeds, or even worse yet, into some water, because a lot of militaries and navies used them too. Yeah. So disassembly was a little more cumbersome, but really the problem appeared with the internals here. First off, the original guide rod, sensibly, you would think, was made of steel, but this actually started to bend and kind of bind up. So later production 5.52s would go to a polymer guide rod, which you might think wouldn't be as durable, but actually it was. It had more flex and would return to its original shape better. Plus, it hurts a little less being hit by a polymer rod and spring than it is a metal rod and spring. Just saying. Also, though, the new bolt carrier design had a weak point where everything would interface, the piston, the chalking handle, and all that. And some guns that had relatively high round counts, at least a few thousand, were reporting cracking bolt carriers. And this is obviously not acceptable for most guns and completely unacceptable for a SiG, if nothing else by their own internal logic. So what are they to do? The 5.52 is a very successful design. They don't want to drop it. Well, unfortunately, around 2000, that's when SiG became SAN, as I've talked about in other sections. So they had to kind of wait. But once they got their act together, beginning around 2004, they started trying to figure out how to fix this. Thus comes in the 5.53. Essentially using newer spring technology and just kind of research, they return the Commando size to a more traditional 5.50, 5.51 style system, meaning the spring is up front, around the gas piston, and all the bolt internals are standard. This is great because, yeah, you can use the same bolt carrier, charging handle. Obviously, the piston is shorter, and they also went to a smaller diameter and fluted piston to save on weight. And they did have to use a different style of spring, different material, and they've used several different types over the years, braided, flat, yada yada. But they at least to let them return to using mostly standard parts for the bolt group. And you don't have anything trying to shoot out the back when you open it, and it also alleviated that stress point on the bolt carrier. So the 5.53 otherwise was the same gun, is the same gun as the 5.52. Same barrel length, same gas system, same options, just more durable and more reliable. So it is rather funny to me when people actively select a 5.52 or say they want one over a 5.53, because externally, aside from the charging handle, they pretty much look identical. The differences are all inside. Where around 2007, the 5.53 came out, and in 2008, the 5.52 was discontinued. And SAN began offering upgrade kits for 5.52 users. Again, they're very much aware of the guns with their names on them out there, and they don't want guns breaking. So they offered very reasonable update packages, sometimes just free. And so many people would send in their 5.52s or just purchase the 5.53 update kit. Now, there was a few changes that had to be made, but it was pretty small, and there's a few kind of artifacts left over, like with the gas block and the front trunnion, how they were slightly different, but I digress. Interestingly, the name of an upgraded 5.52 with 5.53 internals is purportedly to be 5.52A1. And in the Swiss military, as I mentioned, the original 5.52 was called the SGGW-04. Well, they would send most of these in to get updated, and they would become the SGGW-04-07. And it's kind of funny because this reminds me of all the Schmidt-Rubens and whatnot that they updated over the years. You know, going back how they changed all the Fortress and Cavalries to the standard K11. You know, this is something Switzerland has done. You know, waste not, want not. So just carrying on a fine tradition there. So I think a lot of the desire for a 5.52 really is just the well-knownness. But anyway, if you want a gun that's going to last a long time, get the 5.53. Also, it takes standard bolt parts, so that's good as well. Just my humble opinion, though. I do agree that 5.52 is cool, but it was an inherently flawed design, and SiG admitted as much. Size, or overall length. The third digit typically indicates the gas system length. 5.50, the 0 means full rifle length. 5.51 means carbine gas system length. The 2 in 5.52 is a subcompact or commando size. And the 3 in 5.53 is the updated, improved version of the 5.52. Same length of system, but a totally different mechanism. In fact, the 5.52 is kind of the oddball in the family, because all of them are pretty much scaling. They're all based on the same design, which is shorter or longer gas pistons and thus recoil springs and handguards and gas tubes. All but the 5.52, that is. It's the anomaly. But I'll talk about it in a different section, comparing it with the 5.53, because there's so much interest in the 5.52, and I think the 5.53 is a little misunderstood. But yeah, if you're looking at the gun, the digit behind will tell you. And this holds true for other calibers too. For example, the 750, the 751, so on and so forth. Although, of course, the vast majority of production are in 5.6/5.56/223, because that's the primary cartridge. Standard barrel lengths. You have quite a few barrels ranging in different sizes, and they usually correspond to the gas system. Let's start in reverse. The shortest is 8.9 inches. That is found in the 5.52 SB, short barrel, and 5.53 SB. Now that is what SiG, sans SiG, calls a two-piece barrel. All that really means is it's a removable flash hider. So in the SB measurements there, we are not counting the flash hider, because overall length will change depending on which pattern of hider is on. For example, the standard birdcage on the 5.53 today takes the barrel from 8.9, and when it's screwed on, it's more like 10.5, 10.6. But of course, you can unscrew it and put whatever you want, for example, a Surefire, which would make it a little longer. In that same family, 5.52, 5.53, there are LB variants. Now in the 5.52 LB, it is a 13.6 or a 13.7, depending on who you ask, length. And it is a single piece barrel, meaning the flash hider is machined as part of the barrel. Also, this barrel will have the hump for the grenade ring, and thus will be long enough to also support a standard Swiss bayonet, or a NATO bayonet for that matter, depending on which lug you use. Now with the newer 5.53s, there's another LB length listed as 11.9 inches, so just a hair under 12 inches. This is actually about the same length as far as rifling, give or take a tenth of an inch. However, it's a two-piece barrel, thus with removable flash hider. Thus, with the standard A2 on, it's about 13.5. So the two-piece LB found on the 5.53 is slightly shorter than the LB single piece. The funny thing is, it doesn't really have anything to do with the flash hider or the barrel. It has to do with the fact that the LB single piece is most often, almost always, found threaded internally at the very tippy end of the muzzle to accept a blank fire device. And that adds about 0.2 or so of an inch of overall length. Moving on. The 5.51 carbine SB is 14.3, and that is with a single piece barrel, therefore integrated flash hider. These will not have the grenade hump because the barrel barely sticks out past the gas system, past the front sight base, but they will be most often internally threaded for the blank fire device. There is also a 5.51 LB with an extended 17.8-inch barrel. Same thing as with the single piece 5.52, 5.53 LB. Much of that is the flash hider, with the actual rifle portion being more like about 16 and a quarter inches. And it is internally threaded, at least most often, and has the grenade hump, and has the bayonet lug. Moving on from there, we get to the standard 5.50 STGW 90 PE90 rifle. It most frequently is found with a 20.7-inch barrel, and interestingly is most commonly found without the internal threads for a blank fire device. But in other ways, it's like other single-piece barrels. However, some models are made with internal threading for the blank fire device, especially newer production ones, meaning the overall barrel length is more like 20.8, 20.9, a little under 21 inches. That's the takeaway. Like I said, I'm sitting outside. I'm not taking measurements here, but you get the idea. There are two slightly different lengths for the 5.50, but of course, it's almost always found, of course, in the LB style with the muzzle sticking out. Now, when you get to other guns like the 750 and 7.62 NATO and what have you, it might change, but again, primarily it's focusing on the 5.6, 5.56. Special run barrel lengths. I'm not going to hit all of these because there are many. One of the first, though, came about in the 80s for the American market. Obviously, the SG551 with its 14.3-inch barrel would have been considered an SBR and thus non-importable even in the 80s. Because of the 1968 Gun Control Act, all imported civilian guns had to be Title I if they're, again, imported for the civilian market. If they're imported for LE, it's a different story, but I digress. So what SiG in Switzerland did, they extended the barrel out to 16.1 inches to meet minimum overall requirements. This is not a true LB because it's not quite that long. Also, it does not have the grenade hump on the barrel, and the muzzle device is not internally threaded, and most common, if not always, the loop for the bayonet lug has been machined off the bottom of the front sight base. So they just basically extended the barrel a little bit less than 2 inches to make it legal here. They have also done different barrel lengths and different barrel profiles for the 5.50 in the sniper series. By far the most common length is 23 24.7. Okay, it's like 24.685. Well, I don't know, whatever. 24.7 gives you the idea. So 4 inches longer than the standard rifle. But it does not have an integrated flash hider. It has just a target crown, as you would expect for a sniper gun. So it actually has more like 5 inches more of rifling and a target crown. And it's a much heavier profile barrel. But these are still made in relatively small numbers because they were for police use. The military did not use them. There's also a very limited run of carbine length 5.50 snipers with an 18.5 inch barrel. So actually shorter than a standard 5.50, but still the heavy profile, still with the target crown. And again, there are other specialty barrel lengths, no doubt, but those are the ones that just kind of spring to mind at this moment. Sights and rails. Originally, the weapon came with diopter sights. The front was a hooded post that was windage adjustable, and it had a small folding blade for a night sight. It was mounted on top of the gas block. And in the rear, you had a 4-position spinny diopter that was also adjustable. It also had a threaded hole for a removable Irish for truly precision shooting. And in front of it, there was a hole and a mount, and then in front of that, a dovetail where the Swiss cross is for a QD scope mounting system. These are the traditional Swiss diopters. People love them, so on and so forth. But eventually, time moves on, and in the 21st century, SiG SiG has gone to a Picatinny rail setup. The entire top of the receiver has a Picatinny rail, not screwed on, as you would find with the US SiGs that they made, but literally welded, machined, on as part of the upper receiver. So very secure. It ran the full length of the upper. It had an adjustable popsicle rear flip-up back iron sight. And in the front, instead of the traditional hooded fixed front post, it had a small little folding blade sight on a little block that was still windage adjustable. And you can very easily swap the front sight out for the traditional one. Or, alternatively, you can get a set of the modern diopters, which is essentially the same rear diopter as we've known and loved, but on a Picatinny base that you can clamp on to the rear of your pick rail. And then for the front, there's an updated version of the hooded front sight that is a little bit smaller hood, so a little bit more out of the way, and it actually folds down to be out of the way when you're using an optic. So the typical way to do it, if you have these on a military or police gun, you would have an aim point or an ACOG or what have you, and if it went down, you would just flip up your front sight. Now your rear sight, you would actually keep in this handy-dandy little kit, a little tiny little gun case looking case that kept it with its wrench, and you keep that in your pack, and so you just pull that out, pop the sight on, and wrench it down, and you were hopefully back in business, at least to some extent. So it's kind of a compromise, and I have that set up on one of my 5.53s, and it's a very, very neat iron sight set. Metal finish and furniture. Originally, the 5.50 had a very tough kind of ceramic type finish that was gray to gray-green in color on the metal. And it had green furniture. They could kind of go from very green to almost grayish. It was so on that spectrum. The original lowers were stamped in welded steel, just as the upper. As time went on, the furniture would change a bit. For example, the stock contour would change a bit, and the vent hole pattern would change in the handguards. And then they would introduce black furniture, usually paired with a very gray metal finish. And these are often targeted more at police users. while the military still kind of kept on with their gray-green thing. It's also worth pointing out that very early lowers were the so-called double dimple magwell, just to point it out. It's kind of an interesting feature found on the first couple of years of production. And of course, as SiG would become SAN, they would start to offer guns in all kinds of different colors. You have the so-called Blue Star. You have the Red or Red Devil, sometimes you might call it. Now we have the White Alpine. We've got the all-green, kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, version. We're starting to see FDE as a scheme, and we're seeing the interesting heavy metal. The first ones brought over all said heavy metal. Now the newer imports do not say heavy metal, which is great. It's an interesting scheme. Google up pictures if you want to see it, especially steampunk SiG. And they would start using alloy lowers that were milled machined lowers instead of stamped and welded. With modern CNC technology, this is easier to do. It's also, presumably, as durable, at least practically speaking. And it saves weight on an otherwise kind of heavy gun. Not super heavy, but it does save weight and maintains a good balance. I've also noticed stock lockup is a little tighter with the alloy lowers, at least when new. So there definitely are changes in furniture and configuration. There's also a couple of different bipods used for the 550 and several color schemes, although again, the Swiss military is very happy with their gray and green. Although last year they did, after considerable testing, approve the alloy lower for use on their issue guns, so it will be interesting to see. By the way, the alloy lowers, as far as I know, and I probably am wrong about this, typically were in black, meaning they're typically paired with black uppers and guns, and that's something we see in more modern times. They still do the gray, don't worry, but the all black look, especially for police and export, has become popular. So that's a bit of the look. Buttstocks. The SG550 series almost always has a folding buttstock, with very few exceptions. The traditional folder is fixed, at least the length of pull is fixed. The early ones were called whale tail stocks. Later they kind of recontoured it a bit. There's a small loop in the bottom of the triangle cut out of the stock for a sling attachment. There's a metal locking latch to fold it, and the stock will clip to the side of your handguard. There's also a thin rubber butt plate. Not so much to keep you off recoil, but to keep it firmly planted on your shoulder, especially if you're wearing thick clothing and it's icy, wet, what have you. So more for traction. That was the standard, be it in green or black, for a long time in production. But in the last few years, SAN, now SiG again, introduced a variant that was adjustable. It could still fold to the side, same as usual, but now it has 3 positions to set it. And typically you see this on the 553, specifically on the 553 with the Weaver integrated top rail. Although, of course, they will put it on whatever you want. The adjustments are very tight. It's not loose. And it's nice to have a stock you can slide in, because the original stock might be considered a little bit long for some users. Others, maybe not. But options are always good. It's actually quite a nice folding stock, and oddly, it's actually cheaper these days than the traditional fixed folder. And again, you can get it in green-gray, that Swiss color, or black. And I'm sure there's several crazy colors to come as well, as SAN SiG likes having fun with colors these days. Magazines. this is a question I get asked all the time. Does it take AR-15 magazines? No, it does not, because when it was developed, Switzerland was still very much trying to be neutral, so if they had adopted a gun that took a STANAG mag, it would have been not good politically for them. Plus, their mag was better by the standards of the 1980s. You got to remember, the AR-15 mag we know today is not the AR-15 mag that existed in the 60s and 70s. Originally, magazines were 20 rounds, and they had the studs on the side to couple together. Now, I know this will go kind of in the face of what a lot of Americans think. The magazines are all polymer except for the spring. Most people think you need metal, reinforced locking lugs, and feed lips. And on some magazines you do. But the Swiss mags really seem to hold up well. They use the right polymer, and it's quite amazing because their mags are translucent, and it took a lot of other countries and companies quite a bit of time to get translucent down right. But Switzerland seemed to hit it pretty early. And so they were very happy with the 20-round mag for a good long while. But in more recent years, especially as the 5.52 and 5.53 became popular exports, they did begin offering a 30-round mag. It's made of a slightly updated polymer, and it's now kind of become the de facto standard over the 20. And the 30s were originally offered with the studs on the side, although newer production ones can be had either smooth-sided or with the locking studs, your choice. To go along with the mags, Switzerland offers a mag loading tool that you put stripper clips into, made out of the same lightweight, durable polymer material. And there are two types of guide, one for STANAG clips and one for Swiss polymer clips. Speaking of STANAG, in more recent years, you can use AR-15 mags in your 5.5X gun by buying or ordering it with a NATO lower. This is a whole new lower receiver, which is not the firearm on these, so you can have both on your gun. And it's not like the US SiG 5.56 lower, it's a different pattern. All the ones I've seen have been machined aluminum alloy, but I could be wrong. There might be a stamped steel version. But it's mostly the same. It keeps a lot more of those traditional lines, and it still has the hinge trigger guard, still takes the same folding stock. Although they do also offer a side folding adapter that lets M4 type stocks, AR-15 type stocks, M16 stocks fit on if a person wants to do that. Now here in the USA, we like using these adapters to attach arm braces to pistols, but over there they offer it as an accessory for customers. Just kind of consequently, same thing with bayonet lugs. You can either have a Swiss bayonet lug or a NATO spec lug, and it's very easy to change them out. But yeah, I digress. Accessories, they're fun. Slings. Some of the slings used include the early green type with kind of pigtail curly Q hooks that went on to the SGGW90. Oftentimes Swiss soldiers thought these were too short, so they used paracord to make them longer. Then they would go to a version with HK style spring-loaded snap hooks. These would be offered both in green and black. And then they went to a 2-point version of that was updated. It's a tactical sling that has kind of a QD buckle to quickly expand it or contract it. Plus it's wider and made out of a newer nylon material. And it has little elastic covers on the end to keep it from rattling as much. I actually like that sling quite a bit. And then also there are two types that I know of single point sling. And I actually think these are made in France if memory serves, but they are definitely Swiss military issue and are common. But in the end, the guns have HK sling loop type things, so anything with a snap hook can be fitted, or just buy a snap hook and run a sling through it. For example, MFI sold Swiss looking or HK looking type swivels. You could just run a 1-inch or 1 1/4 inch sling through and put whatever you wanted on it. Magazine pouches. Typically, the guns in Switzerland, at least for their military, were issued with 2 magazines, although I'm sure some soldiers acquired more. I have never seen a Swiss mag pouch specifically made for the SGGW90. I have seen some kind of ersatz stuff that people have rigged up with other gear to work, but never a specific mag pouch. If you know of one, please let me know. I've always been curious. Semi-autos. And I'm not even going to get close to mentioning them all, so yeah. Typically for export, versions receive the SP suffix for sport. It's like 550 SP, 551 SP, even 552 SP. At least when they were rifles. For the newer pistol imports, it's usually P, 550P, 551P, 553P. And there's often a dash behind. Dash 1 indicates a 110 twist, and dash 2 indicates a 17. And of course that's true for select fire guns as well. The Swiss domestically typically call them PE, PE90, and its variants. Now the guns aren't marked PE90 over there, but the serial does start with PE. Just that's the semi-auto. As far as in the USA, the first ones were imported around 1987, 1988 by SiG, Sauer, or SIG Arms. I can't remember what they were using then, but they were still based out of Virginia before they moved to New Hampshire. And these were the standard rifle, the SG550. Some were dash 1s, later ones were dash 2s. Some were the early double dimple magwells. No one knows for sure how many came in. The number 400, sometimes the number 500 is often thrown around. Let's just split the difference and say 450 rifles. The rare one are the carbines. As I said in a different section, for the US market, SIG had to make a special 16-inch barrel 551 SP for us. Again, no one knows exactly how many came in, but the number 45 or 50 is often said. And these came in right before the 1989, March 1989 ban on assault rifles. So, under 100, a very, very small number. And of course, this predated the 552, so no 552 SPs came in at that time. Into the 90s, into the post-ban era, DS Arms, DSA, imported a compliant version. So instead of a folding stock, it had a thumb hole. And the barrel lacked the flash hider. It also lacked the bipod, because bipods were among the evil features. And it didn't have night sights. But at this time, in the mid-90s, before 97, you could have standard magazine wells. So they could take standard mags. You don't see many of these DSA guns, and I sincerely don't know how many they brought in, but it was not a large number. Another importer you sometimes see is Capital, who seem to bring them in split in two, kind of like those Saclata Argentine FALs came in two pieces. It seems like Capital brought in or sold some SIG guns as that. But this was the depths of the assault weapons ban from 94 onward, so it was getting harder and harder to get such guns. Now, some semi-auto 551s and 552s mostly were imported with short barrels, mind you, for law enforcement, for police agencies. But they were imported as semi-autos. So put a pin in that, because it will come back to us. And that was really it. Again, around 2000, SIG would become SAN, and it looked like that was all we were going to get for the SG550 family. At least for a while. Now, I'm going to skip over the US SIG Sauer Incorporated SIG 556 right now. I will come back to it in another section. Zooming forward, in 2008, 2009, guns were not coming in, although some parts started to come in, could be available at places like Colorado gun sales. And later, M+M, the import company of Colorado gun sales, was the first to bring in the SAN SG553P pistol. These are the first civilian 553s to ever come in. I mean, the gun was pretty new at that time anyway. The very first versions came in with a pick rail and kind of a 10-inch heavy contour barrel that wasn't threaded. So not great, but hey, the first. The next run came in with diopter sights and a proper profile barrel that was 8.9 inches. Some came in unthreaded, I think. Some of them came in threaded. And some of them were threaded here by M+M. They did such a good job, you really couldn't tell anyway. And these were the first ones that really excited me. And the owner of Colorado Gun Sales, the owner of M+M, was a friend then and is a friend still. Mike, a great guy. He hooked me up. And back then, people were paying buku money for these things, $5-6 grand. And he hooked me up with a really good dealer price on them. And they were slick. But these guns, they were just the versions. They were all black. They had the alloy lower, and they had the black furniture, and again, diopter or rail, your choice. And they had this cool end plate instead of a buttstock, and that's to make it a pistol, of course. But they did it in such a way that they didn't touch the gun. If you wanted to SVR it, all you had to do is drive out a small blind pin with a punch, and then drive out a larger pin, and then your plate would come off the back. Bada boom, bada bang. Of course, later, we would also have arm braces as an option. So, yeah. And around the same time, things got even better for us. Remember those police imported 551 SPs and 552 SPs? Well, companies started buying those. Even though they were imported LEO only, law enforcement only marked, when the law enforcement agencies were done with them, they were still Title I firearms. They were allowed to sell them off. This was great. They were actually exempt from 922R. It's a thing. I'll talk about it later if you want. But they were. They either had to be sold as SBRs, though, or have extensions put on the barrels. So some went both ways. The 552s were primarily sold with a fake suppressor and by Midwest. And they were pretty well worn, but not too bad, but yeah. But really the one who got the deal was Mike Ott, Michael's Machines, MM, not M+M. He purchased a couple of hundred 551-2 SP SWATs. SWAT was just a corrosion-resistant version. I didn't mean it had a rail. And these are short barrels from Louisiana Wildlife Fish and Game. And that was actually one of the earlier videos we did on the main Misha channel around 2012. Kind of one of our early things. And those were great. They were priced pretty fair for what they were. They were about $5,000, $5,500 at that time for the nice condition used ones. Although the unused ones were well over $6K even then. But people spent that much just trying to convert their U.S. guns to Swiss. Of course, these were used guns, not fresh imports. But it was something, and it really whet the market's appetite. I don't know how many of the 552s came in, by the way. Plus, parts kits showed up. Some guns, they came in with full auto receivers, so they couldn't be sold as guns, but they were cut up and then available as kits. Not a problem is you couldn't get receivers, but I digress. Well, the deal with M+M for the SG553P kind of soured because SIG Sauer in New York, sorry, as the cat was meowing, SIG Sauer in New Hampshire, who's meowing at me? Weird. Got in and kind of undercut M+M since they didn't have an exclusive and was able to buy them cheaper from Switzerland, and that's when the price kind of dropped on them. They got relatively cheap at one time, around 3,000. But that didn't last long. I think SiG New Hampshire just did it to cut M+M out, and then once they did that successfully, that was it. But then in 2015, JDI, later to be renamed SAN Imports, became SAN's exclusive distributor here, and this time they got the exclusive, meaning that while other companies have tried to shoe in on their business, they've got a contract, and yeah, the Swiss are sticking to it. And from there, it's really been the golden age. The last 4 years have been the golden age for Swiss collectors. JDI started with 553s, of course, then the 551 SBs, 551 LBs, 550s. The list goes on and on up until late 2020. We just had the SGGW07s come in. The 550 Reddit guns are coming next week. The PE90s are coming next month. The 552s are hopefully coming next month. There was a run of 550 with sniper barrels. And of course, they've done other calibers like the 300 Blackout and now 6.5 Creedmoor, and of course in the past and hopefully in the future again 7.62. And they even show a 50 cal BMG, although I've never actually known anyone to buy one of those. So it's about as good as it's ever been, and it has been for a few years, and prices are about as low as they've ever been. When you adjust for inflation, the current JDI prices are about as good as Swiss is going to get. You know, take it or leave it at this point, frankly. They're not going to get any lower. The U.S. SiG Sauer Incorporated guns. Around 2006, SiG in the USA announced their own line of guns based on the SG550, specifically the SG551. The first one was released and is kind of known as the SIG 556ER. I don't feel like going way too much into them here, but a few things they changed. They took AR-15 mags, they took AR-15 buttstocks. The lower was different. They were threaded half by 28 for AR devices. They had an interesting handguard, and they either had just a pick rail that was bolted onto the upper receiver, not welded, or they had that, plus they had diopter sights or a red dot, but they didn't have Swiss sights. Although the earlier production ones did get made with several Swiss components. The earliest ones even had upper receiver shells that were imported from Switzerland, but very quickly this was switched to US made ones. Some of the early guns also had Swiss bolt groups and gas pistons, even some lower parts, even some furniture components, but very quickly SiG USA switched over to domestic production or even outsourced stuff to allegedly Israel or China or both, who knows. They get a lot of flack from these. Mechanically, they were pretty similar, but they just didn't have the quality, at least in people's minds, that they've been looking for. I actually think they were pretty alright, but yeah, but the features weren't there and the look wasn't there. They eventually tried introducing the SiG 556 Classic, which came with sights that were trying to look like Swiss diopters, but were really just cheap Chinese knockoffs. It did have a side-folding stock, though. Even though most came with U.S. or Chinese knockoff stocks, some came with Swiss, and a Swiss stock could easily be put on. So they were moving in the right direction. Also, they kind of updated the handguards a little bit. In 2011, the SiG 551A1 came out, and that was actually our very first video over on Misha. This was supposed to be a CDNN exclusive between CDNN and SiG Sauer Incorporated, and it was yet another attempt to get closer for the collector market to SG551. They basically gave it a gray Cerakote finish to much of the metal. It took SiG magazines instead of AR-15, And it came with an original Swiss military buttstock. It still didn't come with Swiss sights, still didn't come with Swiss handguards. It came with a unique flash hider that was trying to look Swiss, and it looked more Swiss than AR, I'll give them that credit. It was definitely a step in the right direction. The early ones seemed to be of very high quality. And unfortunately, CD&N did not get an exclusive contract with SiG Sauer, and therefore they started selling them to everyone who wanted one, and mass producing them, and quality dropped. So it kind of became a crapshoot as to which 5.51A1 you get. Some of them were still great out of the box. Others weren't. Some had issues with canted sights. And that top rail had always kind of been a problem for the gun because it was just bolted on. It wasn't welded. So some rails were better than others. And the handguards were just kind of rattly. And the sights were always an issue. And maybe worse yet again, they replaced the original Swiss buttstock with a cheap knockoff copy towards the middle and end of 5.51A1 production, so it became quite important to check inside your stock to make sure it was a legit Swiss part. Good guns, but yeah. They also did the P556, which was a pistol version. Many people thought it would look like a 5.52, but it really wasn't. It had a longer gas system and a longer barrel at about 10 inches. It was just a SiG 5.56 pistol that was very short. It was alright. Then they tried to do the SiG 5.56 XI, making it more AR again, blah, 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 and then they just canceled the production line around 2015, I believe it was. They just finally kind of gave up on it. SIG USA never really seemed all that interested in the design because it was considered the Swiss one. By this time, 2015, they were really wanting to do their own stuff like the MPX, MCX, of course the at the time new P320 pistol. They really were trying to make a name for themselves and separate themselves from the parent company. They had done a few other special production runs using some Swiss parts over the years, but nothing we need to really concern ourselves with here. That just kind of gives you a really brief rundown. Mechanically, they were the same. In fact, most of the time, Swiss parts would drop right in to a U.S. gun. Although, be mindful, the barrels were not interchangeable because they used a different thread pitch in the trunnion, so that wasn't going to happen. But the lowers were, for the most part, interchangeable in bolt groups and so on and so forth. And thankfully, so were the hand guards. And front sights were, rear sights were a little bit more of a trouble. Yada, yada, yada. You get it. We can always talk about it more. But they are the same gun, but they're not. It's like, I don't know, it's like comparing a Century C39 to an Arsenal SAM-7. I don't know. I was trying to think of a second. One might work just fine, but you lose so much of that elegance. And it just seemed like SIG USA just wasn't that interested, and that was the kind of the killer blow. So the good news is them really losing interest meant that JDI was able to come in and start bringing us what we really wanted. So, yeah. For most of us, it was worth it. Accuracy and range. Hell if I know. Why are you asking me? I'm blind. Ask Jay. Ask literally anyone else. I haven't a clue. Reliability and maintenance. Honestly, the Swiss manufactured SG550 guns are very reliable. They handle a wide range of ammo from 55 grain all the way up to 77. Although they do tend to like in the 62 to 69 grain. They will eat brass and steel. Standard is a 2-position gas valve. That one position is just standard, and one is adverse, meant for when the gun is very dirty or when the weather is very cold or high altitudes. So worst case, just use the adverse setting. But it's not something you should really need to call upon. And one thing I like, a lot of people make carbines and rifles that are reliable. But when you get down to guns with 9 and 10-inch barrels, it is harder to have something that's reliable, especially with the shorter barrels. That you don't have much dwell time. But the 5.53s and even the 5.52s run really well, even with lighter loaded stuff like Wolf. There's really just not a problem. But it's no surprise, they're military grade guns. As far as maintenance, they're very forgiving there too. They need very minor lubrication, very little greasing, oiling. Although the Swiss military does issue some, and it's never a bad idea to put it on your rails and other bearing surfaces if you like. But it's not required. One thing, and this is like on an AK-2, do not oil or grease up your gas system. Otherwise, it's going to get pretty nasty pretty quick. And there aren't any parts you need to really worry about. Headspace, I've never heard of headspace issues, at least with the Swiss-produced guns. They seem to be fine. Yeah, they just seem to be very forgiving, which makes sense because these are guns that are expected to go home, at least the original military ones, to go home with individual soldiers, be tossed in a closet, maybe used on weekend matches for qualification and practice. You don't want something that needs routine visits to the unit armorer when he might live across the city. So yeah, they're pretty straightforward. I'd say they definitely got that right from the Kalashnikov. But in there and again from the AR, they got the nice trigger and good ergonomics. So they really did kind of take the best of both worlds, plus, sights and a little bit from the HK. So good stuff. But yeah, I would just say enjoy it. I can't really think of any caveats to say. The magazines you can load up full if you wish. There's not really issues there. And mine at least have run well with the NATO lower when I put it on. But of course the Swiss lower looks cooler. Yeah, I can't think of anything special to say about owning them. They're just very easy guns to get along with. Which version is right for you and how to go about buying it? Well, the second part is easier to answer. JDI, San Imports, Dave Wagner is the exclusive in the USA. So when you're buying new, you buy through him. He imports as many as he can, but Switzerland produces them exceedingly slowly. So typically import batches are anywhere from 20 to 50, sometimes 100 pieces. And if you are told something like 180 days, just expect that to be more like 360. I've had guns literally take over 2 years. Sometimes you'll be pleasantly surprised, though. Just don't get in a hurry. Typically, he requires a $500 deposit. So, not bad, considering the overall cost of the gun. Just pay your deposit, and don't worry about it. They will come in eventually. Worst case, he will refund you. He's yeah. He does do a lot of communication over Facebook, which I know a lot of people don't care for. I don't blame them. I don't own a Facebook account, never have, probably never will. But you can always pick up the phone and call. He also is pretty good with emails too, so if you don't do Facebook, just email or call him. I had the best luck with calls, though. So that's the way to go about doing that. As far as if you want one of the US-made guns, again, the production line's over, so you'll have to just check a gun broker. Just know what you're getting. Just check it out, the usual stuff. But if you want to buy Swiss, you're gonna get the JDIs, and the older M+M imports are no better, no worse, because they're all Swiss made. So yeah, there's not like one that's super better than anything else. as to which one is right for you. Now, typically, you're going to have to just settle for whichever one is available. But let's just say they're all available at once. All the products are in. Again, let's start with caliber. There's a few calibers now. I prefer 5.56 because it's the caliber the gun was originally made for. Plus, I just like 5.56. The 7.62 NATO guns are also quite nice, although they are rather pricey. So that would probably be my second pick. I'm not into 300 Blackout. If you are, cool. Seriously, I don't mind. It's just not my thing. The 6.5 Creedmoors are not out yet, although they should be coming soon. We'll see how they do. And one I haven't really mentioned much in this video, the SG553 RP. That's the 7.62x39 Russian version. They're also quite fun, but I don't know when more will come in. And frankly, there's a lot of nice AKs chambered for that, for example, Arsenals. So, up to you. Although the 5.53 RPs were slightly cheaper than most of the other 5.53s. But, that's an option. So let's just say 5.56. You're basically looking at barrel length and gas system length. The 5.50 is often popular because it's the classic STGW 90 PE 90. That's, its classic looks. That's good. It's also going to deliver you very good accuracy with that long barrel. And it has a bipod that's at least not useless. And the extra barrel is going to keep recoil to nothing. On the flip side, it's pretty long. And it's pretty heavy at over 9 pounds. People complained about the 805 Bren being heavy at 8 pounds. This is a pound heavier. So, as a shooter, while it's very good, it may not be the very, very best all around. I would say, if you're absolutely into target shooting, maybe. And if you're just a collector. Obviously, if you're just going to have one of these guns, and you can, that's the one most people are going to choose because that's the gun. But that is more of a classics type thing. The 5.51. We have the SB and the LB. The SB has an interesting look to it. It's quite a bit lighter, definitely quite a bit shorter. But unfortunately, it's kind of that bad area. It's too short to be a Title I, but it's really not quite short enough for normal people to justify SBRing it. Therefore, I recommend the 5.51 LB. It gets you over the 16-inch mark at 17.8. So, no problems putting a stock on it there. You also get a little more barrel for accuracy. You get a cool looking flash hider, you get a bayonet lug, and a cool looking grenade ring. They're also very reliable, and they're plenty heavy to keep recoil down at about 7.5 pounds, maybe 7.8. But definitely not as long and heavy as a 5.50. I've said in the past that's my favorite in terms of just pure shooter. And honestly, I think it might be, if I take history out of the accounting, the neatest looking one. I think it just looks really well balanced. And I'm a little odd. I kind of like the 5.51 and the old black guys, but that's just me. 5.53s. These are obviously the most common because these are the current standard production. And you can get two types of LB and the SB. Well, the SB is certainly short and light, and it's definitely worth SBRing because, with that short of a barrel, you really are gaining something. Or you can put an arm brace on it. They don't look half bad if you get the Swiss branded adapter on the back there. It costs about $200. You put a nice looking brake like a SBA tactical on it, whatever. So, if you're looking for just compactness, it's small like a Colt Mark 18, and it's very reliable for its size. And it doesn't have bad recoil either. It's got a little bit of twist, especially if you try to shoot it as a pistol. You really do need a brace or a stock on it. But what's nice about those, you can kind of configure them how you want. Diopters, rail. That's the one you can really customize, including the barrel length. As far as the two LBs, the single piece is probably the neater looking of the two, but it really sticks you in a certain range. Again, it's nearly 14 inches, so much like with the 5.51 SB. Is it really worth SBR paperwork for less than 2.5 inches? Maybe it is, but you can't really easily put an extension on it to bring it out to 16. However, with the two-piece LB barrel, which is the 11.9 before the flash rider, you can put on an extension to get to 16 inches and then just pin and weld it. And I've done this on several guns for customers, and the results look really good. I was using the G28 style flash hider from MFI, and it was long enough, and yeah, you can tell it's extended, but it didn't look too doofy. So I would say if you want to do a 5.53 shorty and don't want to SBR it, the two-piece barrel is the LB barrel is the way to go, because it's the easiest one to SBR. I mean, to make a Title I gun, but bring it to 16. Obviously, you can do the same thing with the 8.9 inch, but you're going to have to put basically a fake can on it, and you're basically adding near as much barrel as you are fake barrel and all that. So yeah, and of course with the LB you get the grenade bulge and all that. As far as the 5.52, a special run is coming in late this year. The only real reason to get one of those is as a collector or curiosity. In every way, in a practical sense, the 5.53 is better. Similarly, diopter or rail probably just depends on your preference, frankly. Although there will be a couple of special run of guns from Switzerland that have both. For the first time, they're doing a smaller welded pick rail with a diopter behind it and then a diopter front sight. So that's kind of maybe the best of both worlds. But keep in mind, if you get diopters, it is a couple $100 more. So if you're not going to use them, just get a pick rail. The pick rails are very good. They're very stable, and if you're going to run an optic, then that's really the way to go, says the blind guy. As far as color and all that, that's your choice. As far as the lower, steel versus alloy, they both have pros and cons. The steel is the traditional look, but the alloy does save you some ounces. And while it may not look as attractive, it honestly seems to be just as durable and just as good to go. So I don't think you're gonna lose out there. But it's up to you. And there's all kinds of other factors. Hopefully that helps you pick out one you might want. So yeah, 5.50 if you're a military collector or really into long-range target shooting. 5.53 if you want something really compact and handy and just kind of cool factor. And the 5.51's right in the middle and splits that difference nicely with a cool look, but also a good practical shooter. And I recommend the 5.51 LB because it really is. You don't have to put an extension on it to make it a Title I. At the same time, you don't have near as much stuff out front, and you're saving well over a pound and a half from the standard full-length rifle. But again, really take what you can get, and later, if something better comes along, just put your existing gun on Gunbroker, and I doubt you're going to lose money. These guns, they do pretty well. The future. The truth is, no one knows. I've actually been asked by a number of people recently which one to get for collectibility maybe or whatever, and what I think will come out and what I think is going to happen. And the truth is, we don't know. As with any import, they can be shut off extremely easy. SIG could decide they don't have time to sell. Switzerland could block export. America could block import. the executive branch, the White House, could pass an executive order that bans them, much like they did in '89. Congress can pass new legislation restricting imports like they did in 1968. Individual states that you might live in could pass new laws. JDI could go out of business. Anything can happen. Heck, even this year alone, just the exchange rate has impacted things. So if you want one, there's no time like the present, because you just don't know. I feel very fortunate these have been able to come in for as many years as they have. I'll point you to the Izhmash guns, the Kalashnikov concern guns that Arsenal was bringing in, later VIII, beginning in very late 2008. And I felt very lucky. I mean, I was upset, of course, when the sanctions happened in June of 2014. But I also thought we were very lucky to get over 5.5 years of something we never thought would be imported. Much I can say the same about Molot. And the thing I can say, going back when, about Chinese AKs. I don't think Switzerland's going to do anything to get on a sanction list, but again, other things can throw a spanner in the works, and it can come to a screeching halt. Heck, the ATF or customs can just reinterpret the rules and block further imports. Imports are not a right. Every gun that gets imported comes in per approval and per the good graces of the government. So if they don't want something to come in, they don't really have to justify themselves. They can just block it. So yeah, if you want one, it's something that I would make more of a priority, certainly over domestically produced guns. Domestic guns are certainly more secure. I also don't think that SiG, Sauer Incorporated in the U.S. is going to start up their SG550 production line anytime soon. So, yeah, I think that's why a lot of the U.S. guns are starting to get as expensive as the Swiss guns on Gunbroker. I've seen them go for well over $2,000, $2,500 in some instances. Now, should you buy one, that's much more of a personal decision. Are they objectively better? Do they do things that other guns don't? No, they don't. An AR or an AK or what have you will probably serve you just as well on just, pure shooting things. This is a different thing. It's just, either you get it or you don't. Either it speaks to you or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, I completely understand. It's a lot of money. But for some of us, it really just kind of suits ourselves and has proven both a good investment and something very enjoyable at the range to share with friends. And they're just unique and rare, and probably always will be, because Switzerland's production capacity is just so low, and there aren't really signs that they're ever going to start producing more than a handful of guns a month. And it seems like they do have some new military contracts coming out next year, 2021. So who's to say how many guns they're going to be able to manufacture for JDI? Just saying. But it's a question I get asked a lot, so I thought I would address it. Conclusion and final thoughts. So yeah, this Blackbox, because these are questions that I get asked a lot. I didn't want to put this on the main channel. At the same time, what visuals could I really do? It would have been neat to do like a slideshow of what I was talking about, but that's just something I can't do and never will be able to. But I wanted to share this with you, and that way if people have questions, I can kind of point them to this video, and hopefully they can go to the timestamp, and that at least kind of gets them started. And I apologize for the places I'm sure I got a number wrong or a detail wrong, but hopefully this gives a general idea of what's up. There's just not a ton out there, not compared to other brands like, say, HK on this stuff, but it's a persistent market. One thing to remember, SiG Sans SiG is one of the European makers still left. A lot of the old ones are going away, or have gone away. And they're still one of the European makers, along with like Beretta. We've Valmet no longer makes guns. Seiko doesn't make military guns, all of the manufacturing out of the UK is pretty much over. France is way scaled back. Steyr is still going in Austria. Switzerland still has B&T. HK is still in Germany, but they've had some interesting changeovers this year, and no one's really sure. Of course, we have FN in Belgium. Yeah, just interesting times we live in. I do like imports. Nothing against domestic guns, but the imports are just, a lot of the domestic stuff is just AR, or a derivative of it, and that's fine, but after you have a few ARs, I like having things that are mechanically different and have a different history behind them. And there is that allure of the hard to get, the rare, and, much like a lot of people, I started off by getting a SIG 556, and then thanks to help from Mike at Colorado Gun Sales, buying more and more Swiss parts to try to retrofit it into a Swiss gun. And then I got a SiG 551A1 and bought parts to retrofit it into a Swiss gun. But then the SG553s came in, and then the SG551 SWATs from Mike Ott. And it's just, you realize that if you buy a U.S. gun and swap all the parts that you want to swap, you've already put $3,000 or $4,000 into it, maybe even more. And you could have just bought a Swiss gun. I mean, the only advantage to doing it with the U.S. one is you can do it, piece at a time and kind of spread out the costs. But overall, you're still with a U.S. gun dressed up. It's just, I don't know. Maybe I just don't like second best. But I found that you just save up the money. And the one nice thing about the JDI imports taking so long to come in, it gives you plenty of time to save up. I mean, a lot of these guns take 6 months or a year. And so all you really have to do is stick back, $400 a month or so. And, it's not cheap, but for something you really want, as I've said in a lot of comments and here and the other channel, it's all about priorities. Just kind of what they're up to. But I feel good about them, and I've never really lost money. And I find the history behind them, along with like the Schmidt-Rubens and the SGW57s, the PE57s, I find it all just very interesting. It's very much Germanic, but with its own twist. So yeah, this just seemed like a good video to do. So if I missed anything, let me know. Ask questions in the comments below, and I will do my best to address them. Or if I don't know, just tell you, hey, I don't know. So with that, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And for a video with more visual stimulation, check out our playlist and all the videos over on the main Misha Go channel. With that, I'll let you go. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.